The sun was beginning to set over the Umbrian hills when a young man named Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone wandered aimlessly through the streets of Assisi. He was known by all as Francesco, the son of a wealthy merchant. His life, up until this point, had been one of carefree indulgence. Born into privilege, Francesco had access to every luxury one could imagine. Yet, despite the riches that surrounded him, an emptiness gnawed at his soul. This inner restlessness would soon lead him down a path of radical transformation, one that would change not only his life but the course of history. In his youth, Francesco had been the embodiment of worldly ambition. He loved fine clothes, feasts, and the company of his many friends. His father, Pietro Bernardone, was a successful cloth merchant, and the family business afforded Francesco the freedom to pursue whatever he desired. But there was something different about this young man. Even amidst his revelry, a glimmer of compassion shone through. He had a deep affection for the poor, and although it was not yet fully formed, the seeds of his future calling were already planted in his heart. One of the pivotal moments in Francesco's early life came when he was taken prisoner during a war between Assisi and the neighboring town of Perugia. After a bitter battle, Francesco found himself in a dark and filthy prison, his body weakened by illness. It was here, in the silence of his suffering, that he began to contemplate the fleeting nature of the life he had been living. Before continuing with this video, I would like to invite you to reflect with us on our spiritual life as Catholics. Many times, in the hustle and bustle of everyday life, we set prayer aside, even though we know how important it is for our spiritual life. With this in mind, I have created an ebook called Prayer Routine for Catholics. In it, I share simple and effective ways to integrate prayer into your daily life, bringing more serenity and closeness to God. This material is a valuable companion for those who wish to live their faith more intensely and consistently. The link to the ebook is in the first comment of this video. Click the link and receive your ebook right now. May God bless you. He had always dreamed of becoming a knight, but as he lay there in chains, he realized that earthly glory was not what his heart truly desired. After a year in captivity, Francesco was released, but he was not the same person who had entered that prison. The seeds of his conversion were beginning to take root. However, it would still take time for him to fully understand the radical call that God had placed upon his life. Upon his return to Assisi, he resumed his old lifestyle, but something had changed. The pleasures that once thrilled him now left him feeling empty. He began to seek solitude, withdrawing from his former companions, and praying more frequently. It was during one of these moments of solitude that Francesco had a profound spiritual experience. While praying in the dilapidated church of San Damiano, he heard a voice speaking to him from the crucifix, "Francesco, go and repair my house, which, as you can see, is falling into ruin." At first, he interpreted this command literally. He began to rebuild the physical structure of the church, using his own hands to repair the crumbling walls. But as time went on, he realized that Christ was calling him to something much greater. He was being called to rebuild the spiritual foundation of the church itself. As his transformation deepened, Francesco began to detach himself from the material wealth that had once defined him. His father, Pietro, was furious when his son started giving away goods from the family business to the poor. The tension between father and son reached its breaking point when Francesco, in a dramatic public gesture, renounced his inheritance. Standing before the bishop and the people of Assisi, Francesco removed the fine clothes his father had given him and declared that he would no longer call Pietro Bernardone his father. Instead, he would live only for God, embracing poverty as his bride. From that moment on, Francesco dedicated himself entirely to living out the gospel. He embraced a life of radical poverty, walking barefoot through the streets, dressed in simple rags, and begging for his daily bread. His joy was contagious, and soon, others began to follow him. These first companions formed the beginnings of what would become the Franciscan order. They lived in community, sharing everything, and spending their days in prayer, work, and preaching. Their message was simple: to live according to the teachings of Christ, without compromise. One of the most remarkable aspects of Francesco's spirituality was his deep love for all of creation. He saw every living creature as a reflection of God's beauty and goodness. Birds, animals, trees, and even the sun and moon were his brothers and sisters. This profound sense of kinship with creation earned him the nickname the Little Poor Man, Il Poverello. He would often be seen preaching to the birds or speaking tenderly to animals, reminding them of their Creator's love. In a time when humanity's relationship with nature was often one of domination, Francesco's vision was revolutionary. Despite his growing reputation as a holy man, Francesco remained humble. He refused to be ordained a priest, insisting that he was unworthy of such an honor. He preferred to serve as a deacon, devoting himself to preaching the Word of God. His sermons were not elaborate theological discourses, rather, they were simple, heartfelt exhortations to love God and one's neighbor. He spoke with such conviction and joy that even the hardest of hearts were moved by his words. As more and more people joined Francesco in his way of life, the need for structure became apparent. In 1209, he traveled to Rome with a small group of his companions to seek the approval of Pope Innocent III for their way of life. It was a bold move. Francesco was a nobody, a ragged beggar from a small town, but his humility and sincerity made a deep impression on the Pope. Legend has it that the Pope had a dream in which he saw the Lateran Basilica, the very heart of Christendom, about to collapse. In the dream, it was a small, poor man who propped it up with his shoulder. The Pope interpreted this as a sign from God and gave Francesco his blessing to form what would become the Order of Friars Minor. With the Pope's approval, the Franciscan movement began to spread rapidly. Men and women from all walks of life were drawn to Francesco's message of simplicity, humility, and love. He founded the Order of Poor Clares for Women, led by his spiritual sister, Clare of Assisi. Together, they formed a powerful force for renewal within the Church, showing the world that true happiness could be found not in wealth or power, but in loving and serving God. Francesco's love for the poor was legendary. He saw Christ in the faces of the destitute and the outcast. One of the most profound moments of his life came when he embraced a leper on the outskirts of Assisi. Lepers were feared and shunned by society, yet Francesco was moved by compassion. He kissed the leper's diseased hand, and in that moment, he felt a profound sense of joy and peace. This act of mercy became a turning point in his spiritual journey, solidifying his commitment to live out the gospel in radical ways. Throughout his life, Francesco sought to imitate Christ in every way. He believed that the key to true freedom was to let go of all attachments, whether to material possessions, personal ambitions, or even one's own will. This radical detachment allowed him to experience a deep intimacy with God. He would often retreat to solitary places in the mountains or forests to pray, fasting for days at a time. It was during these moments of solitude that he experienced some of his most profound spiritual encounters. One such encounter occurred in 1224, while Francesco was praying on Mount La Verna. As he meditated on the Passion of Christ, he was suddenly enveloped in a vision of a crucified seraph. When the vision ended, Francesco found that he had been marked with the stigmata, the wounds of Christ's crucifixion, on his hands, feet, and side. He had been so closely united with Christ in his suffering that he now bore the physical signs of the crucifixion in his own body. This miraculous event was a profound sign of Francesco's holiness and his total identification with the suffering Christ. Despite the pain of the stigmata and the physical ailments that plagued him in his later years, Francesco remained full of joy. He composed the Canticle of the Sun, a beautiful hymn of praise to God for all of creation. In this poem, he referred to the sun, moon, stars, wind, water, and even death as his brothers and sisters. His deep love for creation was not just poetic, it was a reflection of his belief that all things are connected, and that every creature is a gift from God. Francesco's health continued to deteriorate, but his spirit remained strong. In 1226, sensing that his end was near, he asked to be taken to the Porziuncola, a small chapel that had become the heart of the Franciscan movement. Surrounded by his brothers, Francesco lay on the bare ground, in imitation of Christ's poverty. As he lay dying, he sang praises to God, filled with peace and gratitude for the life he had been given. His final words were a reminder of the joy and simplicity that had defined his entire life. "I have done what is mine to do, may Christ teach you yours." On October 3, 1226, Francesco of Assisi passed from this life to the next, leaving behind a legacy that would endure for centuries. His life was a testament to the power of radical love, humility, and faith. The Church recognized his sanctity almost immediately. In just 2 years after his death, he was canonized by Pope Gregory IX. The little poor man from Assisi had become one of the most beloved saints in the history of the Church. Over the centuries, Francesco's influence has only grown. His followers, the Franciscans, continue to live out his vision of poverty, simplicity, and love for all of creation. The example of his life has inspired countless people to turn their hearts toward God, to embrace the poor, and to care for the earth. In a world often driven by materialism and greed, the message of Francesco remains as relevant today as it was in his time. His life reminds us that true wealth is not found in possessions, but in the love of God and neighbor. One of the most enduring aspects of Francesco's legacy is his commitment to peace. Before continuing with this video, I would like to invite you to reflect with us on our spiritual life as Catholics. Many times, in the hustle and bustle of everyday life, we set prayer aside, even though we know how important it is for our spiritual life. With this in mind, I have created an ebook called Prayer Routine for Catholics. In it, I share simple and effective ways to integrate prayer into your daily life, bringing more serenity and closeness to God. This material is a valuable companion for those who wish to live their faith more intensely and consistently. The link to the ebook is in the first comment of this video. Click the link and receive your ebook right now. May God bless you. He was a man of peace in a time of violence and conflict. He traveled to the Holy Land during the Fifth Crusade, not as a warrior, but as a peacemaker. In a bold and dangerous move, he crossed enemy lines to meet with the Sultan of Egypt, hoping to bring about peace through dialogue rather than war. Though he did not succeed in ending the conflict, his courage and faith left a lasting impression on the Sultan, who treated him with great respect. Even today, Francesco's love for peace continues to inspire movements for reconciliation and nonviolence. His example calls us to be instruments of peace in our own lives, to seek harmony in our relationships, and to be agents of healing in a world often torn apart by division and hatred. As we reflect on the life of this remarkable saint, we are reminded of the transformative power of faith. Francesco's journey from a life of luxury and indulgence to one of radical poverty and holiness is a testament to the grace of God at work in the human soul. His life challenges us to examine our own priorities, to let go of the things that hold us back from fully following Christ, and to embrace the path of simplicity, humility, and love. The story of Francesco of Assisi is not just the story of a man who lived 8 centuries ago. It is the story of a soul completely transformed by the love of God. It is the story of a heart so open to grace that it became a living reflection of Christ's own heart. The life of Francesco serves as a powerful reminder that sainthood is not reserved for the extraordinary or the elite. He was a simple man, born into a small town, with no special gifts or privileges other than his father's wealth. Yet, through his complete surrender to God's will, Francesco became one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of the Church. His holiness did not come from his own abilities, but from his willingness to let God work through him. One of the most striking aspects of Francesco's transformation was his deep sense of joy. Even after renouncing all worldly possessions and embracing a life of extreme poverty, his spirit was filled with an unshakable happiness. This joy did not come from material comfort, but from the knowledge that he was living fully in accordance with God's will. For Francesco, the gospel was not a set of rules to follow out of obligation, it was a source of endless joy, a path to true freedom. Francesco's joy was so infectious that it drew people to him wherever he went. Those who encountered him saw in him a reflection of Christ's love and mercy. His radiant smile, his humility, and his tenderness toward all living things captivated the hearts of those who crossed his path. Many were inspired to leave their own lives behind to follow him, not because of any great speeches or theological arguments, but because of the simple, authentic joy he exuded. As the Franciscan movement grew, Francesco faced the challenge of leading a large and diverse group of followers. While he was a man of deep humility, he also had a strong sense of purpose and vision. He insisted that his friars live in strict poverty, without owning property or accumulating wealth. This radical commitment to poverty was a way of imitating Christ, who had no place to lay his head. But it also served as a powerful witness to a world increasingly obsessed with materialism and power. Despite his insistence on poverty, Francesco was not rigid or harsh. He understood that true poverty meant living with a spirit of detachment from material things, rather than mere physical deprivation. He often told his brothers that their joy should come from knowing that they were poor in spirit, not from suffering for its own sake. He believed that their poverty was not a burden, but a blessing, a way to rely completely on God's providence. One of Francesco's greatest gifts was his ability to see beauty in the simplest things. He often marveled at the beauty of nature, praising God for the sun, the moon, the stars, and even the smallest of creatures. This sense of wonder permeated his entire life and ministry. He saw God's hand in everything, from the birds of the air to the flowers of the field. For Francesco, creation was not something to be dominated or exploited, but something to be cherished and cared for, as it reflected the glory of the Creator. This love for creation also shaped Francesco's understanding of humanity's role in the world. He believed that we are stewards of God's creation, called to protect and care for it. Long before modern environmental movements, Francesco was preaching the importance of respecting the earth and all its creatures. His teachings on this matter continue to resonate today, as the Church calls for greater care for our common home, the earth. Francesco's love for the poor and the outcast was not limited to words. He lived it every day. He and his friars would regularly go out into the streets, not just to preach, but to serve. They would care for the sick, feed the hungry, and embrace the marginalized. Francesco believed that in serving the least of these, they were serving Christ himself. His life was a living example of the gospel command to love one's neighbor, especially the most vulnerable. One of the most moving stories from Francesco's life is his encounter with a beggar during a celebration in Assisi. At the height of the festivities, Francesco, dressed in fine clothes, saw a poor beggar in rags standing in the crowd. Without hesitation, he exchanged his clothes with the beggar, giving him his own rich garments. It was a gesture that shocked many, but for Francesco, it was a simple act of love, one that reflected his deep conviction that Christ is present in the poor. The humility that defined Francesco's life also shaped his relationship with his brothers. Though he was the founder and leader of the Franciscan order, he never saw himself as superior to his fellow friars. In fact, he often referred to himself as the least of the brothers and sought to serve them in any way he could. He would wash their feet, tend to them when they were sick, and encourage them with gentle words. His leadership was not based on authority or power, but on love and humility. Francesco also had a profound respect for the Church and its authority. Despite his radical way of life, he always sought the approval of the Church for his actions. He understood that true reform could only come from within the Church, in obedience to its teachings and guidance. This respect for authority was a hallmark of his humility. Even when faced with opposition or misunderstanding, Francesco never wavered in his loyalty to the Church. Throughout his life, Francesco maintained a deep devotion to the Eucharist. He believed that the presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament was the greatest gift God had given to humanity. He would often spend hours in prayer before the Eucharist, contemplating the mystery of God's love made manifest in the sacrament. His reverence for the Eucharist was so profound that he urged his brothers to treat the altars and churches with the greatest care, knowing that these were places where Christ himself dwelled. As Francesco's health continued to decline, his commitment to living out the gospel never wavered. Even in the midst of his suffering, he remained focused on the love of God. His physical pain became a means of drawing closer to Christ, who had suffered on the cross. In this way, Francesco saw his own suffering not as a burden, but as a participation in the redemptive suffering of Christ. He accepted his infirmities with grace, always trusting in God's providence. One of the most remarkable aspects of Francesco's legacy is the way he transcended cultural and religious boundaries. His life and message resonated not only with Christians but with people of all faiths. His encounter with the Sultan of Egypt during the Crusades is a powerful example of this. Francesco did not go to the Sultan as an enemy, but as a brother, seeking peace. Though the two men came from vastly different backgrounds, they found common ground in their shared humanity and mutual respect. This openness to dialogue and peacemaking is perhaps one of the most enduring lessons from Francesco's life. He understood that true peace could only be achieved through love and understanding, not through force or violence. His example calls us to look beyond our differences and see the face of God in every person, regardless of their beliefs or background. In a world often divided by conflict and hatred, Francesco's message of peace is more relevant than ever. As the years passed, Francesco's influence spread far and wide. His followers, the Franciscans, took his message of simplicity, poverty, and love to the far corners of the earth. They became missionaries, spreading the gospel to new lands and peoples. Wherever they went, they carried with them the spirit of their founder, a spirit of humility, joy, and deep faith. The Franciscan movement became one of the most influential forces for good in the Church, touching countless lives through its works of mercy and evangelization. Francesco's relationship with Clare of Assisi was another important chapter in his life. Clare, like Francesco, came from a wealthy family, but she was inspired by his example and desired to follow him in a life of poverty and prayer. With Francesco's guidance, she founded the Order of Poor Clares, a contemplative community of women who dedicated their lives to prayer and penance. The bond between Francesco and Clare was one of deep spiritual friendship, rooted in their shared love for Christ. The Poor Clares, under Clare's leadership, embraced a life of strict poverty, following the example of Francesco. Their way of life was austere, but it was filled with joy and peace. Clare's dedication to the vision of Francesco helped ensure that the Franciscan movement would continue to thrive long after his death. Together, they showed the world the power of a life lived completely for God, free from the distractions of wealth and power. As Francesco's final days approached, he continued to draw closer to God. His body was weak, ravaged by illness and the wounds of the stigmata, but his soul was at peace. He spent his last days at the Porziuncola, the small chapel that had been the heart of his ministry. Surrounded by his brothers, he prepared to meet the Lord with the same humility and joy that had defined his entire life. Francesco's death was not a moment of sadness, but of profound grace. His passing was a celebration of the life he had lived, a life that had been completely dedicated to God. As he lay dying, he asked his brothers to sing the Canticle of the Sun, the hymn of praise he had written to honor God's creation. His soul, filled with peace, returned to the Creator who had given him the grace to live such a holy life. The legacy of Francesco of Assisi is one that continues to inspire millions of people around the world. His life shows us that holiness is not beyond our reach. It is found in the simple, everyday acts of love, humility, and service. Francesco's radical commitment to living out the gospel challenges us to examine our own lives and to ask ourselves whether we are truly following Christ with all our hearts. Francesco's message of poverty and simplicity speaks directly to the consumerism and materialism that often dominate modern society. He reminds us that true happiness cannot be found in possessions or wealth, but in living for God and for others. His life calls us to detach ourselves from the things of this world and to seek the riches of heaven. The example of Saint Francis of Assisi continues to resonate with people from all walks of life. Whether through his love for the poor, his reverence for creation, or his dedication to peace, Francesco offers a model of holiness that is as relevant today as it was in the 13th century. His life was a reflection of Christ's own life, a life of self-giving love, humility, and joy. As we conclude this reflection on the life of Saint Francis of Assisi, we are invited to consider how we might follow in his footsteps. What can we learn from his example? How can we embrace a life of simplicity and humility? How can we bring peace to a world that so desperately needs it? The story of Francesco is a story of transformation, of a soul that was completely changed by the love of God. His life challenges us to open our hearts to that same love, to allow God to transform us from within. Just as Francesco was called to repair the church in his time, we too are called to be instruments of renewal in our own lives and in the world around us. In the end, the life of Saint Francis of Assisi is a testament to the power of faith, hope, and love. It is a reminder that holiness is not something reserved for a select few, but something that all of us are called to. We are all called to be saints, to live lives of radical love for God and for our neighbors. May the example of Saint Francis inspire us to seek God with all our hearts, to love with all our strength, and to live with the same joy and humility that he did. Through his intercession, may we find the courage to follow Christ more closely and to embrace the path of holiness that God has prepared for each one of us. As we go forth from this reflection on the life of Saint Francis of Assisi, let us carry with us his spirit of joy, peace, and love. Let us remember that, like him, we are called to be instruments of God's grace in the world, bringing healing, hope, and light to all those we encounter. Saint Francis of Assisi, pray for us.